Kelvin is an ugly, disgusting loser who kicked the bucket because God made a mistake. So, to apologize for doing humanity a favor, God decided to curse another world by reincarnating Kelvin in it. He reincarnated as an S-rank black summoner that level up a simple slime into the demon king of gluttony. The clouds part and a beam of light pierces through and lands on the ground below in the middle of a forest. Different animals, including slimes, come out of hiding to check out their new visitors. Kelvin is lying on a bed of grass with his eyes closed. The wind softly caresses his hair and the grass around. Kelvin opens his eyes and gets up to his feet. He looks around, trying to get his bearings, but he's unfamiliar with the strange environment. Suddenly, a screen comes up in front of him, welcoming him to a new world. There's also an arrow pointing to a start button which will launch Kelvin into an adventure. Kelvin looks around once again, wondering how he got to a new world. He cautiously taps the start button, and a voice announcer congratulates him for winning the lottery that got him transferred to a new world. The window swirls around him and the voice announcer tells him his memory was erased during his reincarnation. But they only did it because he gave his consent. Kelvin is shocked to find out he's reincarnated. He tries to recall his past, but he doesn't have any memory of it. He is pissed at his past self for giving up his memories during his reincarnation. The voice announcer tells him the current world is one of magic and swords, just like every generic fairy tale. She tells him he learned some skills before the transfer to a new world. She tells him to look at his status screen for more details on the kind of skills he has. Kelvin was doing his best to comprehend his current reality without freaking out, but the last statement of the voice announcer piques his interest. He looks at his skills on the status screen and notices he's more of a support type person in the new world. He notices the benefits of leveling up are pretty good as well, and he cracks a smile. He thinks his old self must have been a darn good gamer since he was so excited to learn about his skills. He notices his role in the new world as a summoner, and the voice announcer tells him to head for the nearby town to get registered. Kelvin sets out towards the town and the menu screen goes along with him. He asks her if she would keep following him like that, and she shows him information about her, including her name and age. Her name is Melfina and she's over 1,000 years old. She tells him he was the only one who asked her, the goddess of reincarnation, to be his follower. She asks him to take good care of her, and once again Kelvin wonders why his past self did such a thing. The goddess Melfina tells him that because of the connection between a summoner and his follower, they can communicate telepathically. Kelvin arrives in Parth and Melfina tells him about his reincarnation. She explains that she made a pact to come with him because Kelvin claimed he loved her. As Kelvin walks, he asks Melfina to restore his memories, but she explains he traded them for skill points and can't get them back. Kelvin thinks that since he doesn't have his memories, he doesn't have feelings for her anymore. Yet, she reminds him that he promised that he would fall for her at second sight. Embarrassed, Kelvin collapses from cringe and notices people staring. He runs to a quiet spot to think about Melfina and if she's his type. He continues exploring the town as he asks Melfina if he can summon her, and she tells him he needs more magic points to make her materialize. She tells him she looks forward to his confessions of love when he eventually summons her, but he assures her he'll make no such confessions. Melfina draws his attention to the Adventurers Guild building just ahead. He enters the building and meets a receptionist. He tells her he wants to register as an adventurer, and she hands him a form to fill. He's about to begin when Melfina asks him to hold on. She warily asks him if he intends to register his class as a summoner. He asks her if there's anything wrong with that, and she tells him summoners are so rare that sometimes entire countries don't even have a single summoner. She tells him if word gets out that he's a summoner, he may have to face great political powers. After hearing this, Kelvin decides to register as a green mage. Angie, the receptionist, takes the form and asks Kelvin to wait for a moment. She returns with his guild card and hands it to him. She tells him he starts from rank F since he's new to the guild. She shows him how the guild splits quests between the adventurer ranks. He asks her if he can't only accept F rank quests, and she tells him he can also accept quests that are one rank higher than his guild rank. She then tells him there's a penalty for failing a quest, and Kelvin makes a mental note not to challenge higher rank quests foolishly. She tells him he needs to complete 10 consecutive rank quests to level him, and thus would apply for rank D as well. She tells him from rank C upwards, he has to pass an examination before his rank can be raised. He asks her if there are any beginner quests, and she puts out 3 quests before him. Kelvin chooses to go on the blue slime quest, and Angie notes it. Kelvin goes to the location of the blue slime, and he immediately spots several slimes hanging around. He ducks behind a bush to avoid being seen. Melfina tells him to try using his Analyze Eye skill. Kelvin peeks through the bush and uses his skill on the blue slime. His skill shows him the stats of the blue slime, and now he knows that skill is used to read the stats of enemies. Melfina tells him his Analyze Eye skill is S rank, which allows him to view the stats of creatures that are less than 100 levels above him. She tells him he can also use the skill on all items that are S rank or below. Kelvin wonders what he'll do to form a pact with the slime since he's a summoner. He immediately leaps out of the bush with his stick raised, ready to attack the slime. The slime finally notices Kelvin, but he strikes it with his stick before the poor slime can do anything. The impact of the strike knocks the slime into the air, and it bounces off the ground severally before coming to a rest. Kelvin uses his Analyze skill in the slime, and he sees it has just 3 health points out of 5. He now wants to form a pact with the slime. Melfina tells him to hold out his arm towards it. He holds out his hands and the slime bursts into particles of light which Kelvin absorbs. Melfina congratulates him on his first pact. Kelvin is surprised it was so simple. Melfina tells him his new monster doesn't have a name, and she asks him what he would like to name it. Kelvin thinks for a while and names the slime Clotho. Kelvin asks Melfina if his remaining magic points would be enough to summon the slime, and she tells him it'll be sufficient. Kelvin summons Clotho, and he's happy he's completed his objective as a summoner. He now knows it's time to take out some slimes to complete his quest. Kelvin and Clotho sneak up on some slimes. Kelvin uses his wind strike magic to take out one while Clotho dances around another and takes it out with a body slam. Kelvin commends Clotho and Melfina commends him for his combat. After the battle, Kelvin decides to call it a day, but Clotho begins acting very strangely. Kelvin wonders if he took too much damage during the battle, but Melfina tells him Clotho is about to evolve. Clotho evolves into a slime Glatinia, a monster which wiped out a nation of water several hundred years ago. She tells him he's now a legendary monster, almost as powerful as a demon lord. Kelvin is amazed at Clotho's transformation. Kelvin returns to the Adventurers Guild and Angie congratulates him for completing his quest. She tells him he has now been promoted to E rank, and Kelvin thanks her. She tells him to get better equipment after she notices he's still using the same equipment he had on when he registered as an adventurer the previous week. Kelvin tells her he would do that, but he asks her to show him the D rank quests that are available. An adventurer named Cashel cuts in, catching both Kelvin and Angie by surprise. He tells Kelvin to try out the Black Spirit Knight subjugation quest since he's looking for a D rank quest. Kelvin accepts the quest and goes to the location of the Black Spirit Knight. He enters the room to find the Spirit Knight standing in the middle of it. He uses his Analyze Eye skill to look at the stats of the Black Knight. He is surprised the Black Knight has a name. The Black Knight is called Gerard, and Kelvin wants to make him his companion. Melfina is surprised he isn't nervous at all after looking at the knight's stats. Gerard plunges its sword into the floor and asks Kelvin to state his business. Kelvin walks into the room and tells Gerard he initially came to defeat him to complete his objective, but he says he's changed his mind. He introduces himself to Gerard and tells him he wants to form a pact with him. Gerard tells him everyone else who comes into the room just attacks him on sight, and he's the first person to ever engage him in a conversation. He tells Kelvin he recently became a monster, and he was previously a human knight captain that served the country. Gerard offers him some candy, and Kelvin is surprised by how chill he is. Melfina reminds him of the pact, and Kelvin asks Gerard if he'll form a pact with him. Gerard tells Kelvin the king and the kingdom he swore loyalty to are both gone now. He tells Kelvin he's not against serving a new king, but Kelvin notices he is a bit hesitant. Kelvin understands his hesitancy and tells him he knows he must prove himself worthy with a duel. He tells Gerard not to hold back during the duel. They begin the duel, and Kelvin starts with a wind shot at Gerard. Gerard blocks the shot with his sword, and Kelvin immediately calls on Clotho to attack Gerard from his blind spot. Gerard easily blocks all of Clotho's strikes and pins him with his foot. Kelvin is impressed by this. Melfina tells him that Gerard possesses the Mind Eye skill, which increases his awareness and reflexes. Gerard tells Kelvin to show him what he's got, or the duel won't be worth it. Kelvin summons an earth barrier around Gerard, and Clotho self-destructs. Gerard is surprised by the number of tricks Clotho has in his bag. Gerard raises his sword, and Melfina immediately warns Kelvin to dodge to the side, and he does so. Gerard smashes his sword on the ground, sending out an energy wave that breaks the barrier and destroys the floor where Kelvin was some moments ago. Kelvin didn't even see his attack coming. He uses magic to create a chasm below Gerard's feet, but even while imbalanced, Gerard sends a sword strike towards Kelvin. Kelvin is impressed by Gerard's ability to adapt. A sword penetrates Gerard's armor out of nowhere, and Clotho engages him in combat using his tentacles. Kelvin commends him for being a good fighter, But while Clotho keeps him distracted, Kelvin casts a skill of air pressure. Gerard can't move as air pressure is brought down against him. Kelvin tells him to give up, but he breaks free from the spell. He sends a wind strike towards Kelvin, but he blocks it with an earth barrier. Gerard asks him if he has what it takes to fulfill his final desire. Kelvin casts another air pressure on Gerard and he orders Clotho to fire. Clotho fires a huge pillar of fire that takes out Gerard. Gerard calls out the names of his previous friends as he is defeated. Kelvin forms a pact with him. The next day, Kelvin takes a piece of Gerard's armor to the Adventurers Guild. Angie confirms it's from the Black Knight and she tells Kelvin he has completed the quest. The other adventurers praise Kelvin for defeating the knight despite being a newcomer. Kelvin gets promoted to B rank and news of his promotion spreads around the adventurers and the entire town. While walking down the street, citizens congratulate him on his promotion. He walks into Claire's shot and she rushes to hug him. He asks her how she found out about his promotion already and she tells him all the adventurers are talking about it. She tells him she has never heard of anyone being promoted to B rank so fast. While walking back home, Kelvin sees some ladies trapped in a cage and put in a carriage. A small crowd of men stand around the carriage. They have silver collars on their neck and Melfina tells him they are slaves. Kelvin recalls that he still has free slots for new followers and he thinks it's a good idea to get an extra companion. The slaver putting the ladies up for sale tells the people gathered the slave is a half-elf. Kelvin walks closer to the cages and looks at the eyes of the lady. She looks so sad and miserable. A man decides to buy one of the slaves. He touches her and his hair immediately catches fire. The slaver helps him put it out, but the man tells the slaver he won't be making the purchase again because the slave is cursed. He runs off and the slaver sighs dejectedly. Kelvin looks at the slave and the slaver tells him she always burns whoever touches her. Kelvin uses his Analyze Eye skill to look at her stats and he's happy he hadn't used up his skill points. He asks Melfina how he can break her curse and she tells him the curse was from a fire dragon king. She tells him he needs the sacred blessing of a white magic user, which is what an A-rank adventurer is called. The slave looks at Kelvin and he decides to buy her. He hands the slaver a bag of coins and asks if it's enough. The slaver opens the cage of the half-elf and she follows Kelvin. They walk down the street and she introduces herself as Ethel to Kelvin. Kelvin also introduces himself to her and tells her he would like her to join his party and fight alongside him. She tells him she won't be of much use to him because of her curse. Kelvin lays his hands on her head and breaks the curse. He touches her hair and her arms to prove to her that she's fine now that her curse is broken. He tells her she won't hurt anyone else with cursed flames and she falls to her knees in tears. She declares him as her master and he just pats her head to calm her down. Melfina is glad the white blessing worked. Kelvin tells her he used his leftover skill points to obtain the skill. Kelvin gives her a maid's dress and Ethel swears loyalty to Kelvin as they enter Claire's inn. They eat a meal prepared by Claire and Ethel enjoys it so much that it brings tears to her eyes. Kelvin and the rest spend some days completing quests to increase their levels. He then returns to the Adventurers Guild and gets paid for completing the quests. Angie tells Kelvin he just needs to complete one more quest before he's eligible for a promotion exam. Kelvin is told someone is waiting for him. He goes into the guild house to find Leo, the head of the Adventurers Guild, waiting for him. The guild master takes Kelvin to his office and tells him about a demon which was spotted in a D-rank dungeon called Hermit's Cave by some adventurers in a secret room. Melfina tells Kelvin that demons are one of the strongest beings in the world. Kelvin asks how the adventurers made it out alive and Leo tells him the demon was sealed so they didn't attack it recklessly. Leo tells Kelvin he's skeptical about assigning the quest to him because he has no idea how strong the demon may be. Leo tells him the quest may be S rank while Melfina tells him the strength of demons varies with the weakest being B rank. Leo asks him if he'll accept the quest and Kelvin accepts it immediately. Kelvin and his companions head over to Hermit's Cave. Old walks up to Kelvin and Ethel to greet them. He doesn't know Gerard, so Gerard introduces himself. Kelvin asks Old for an update on the situation and he tells him they cast a barrier over the cave and are standing watch. Kelvin tells him to stay on guard with his men as they enter the cave to find the demon. Ethel casts a light spell and Kelvin tells Gerard to lead the way while Clotho guards their rear. They venture deep into the cave but they have not encountered the demon. Kelvin is uneasy because he can't sense any monsters or any living demons. They arrive at the door and Kelvin tells them he senses two presences behind the door. He says one is the demon which is greatly weakened by the spell while the other presence is the real threat. Kelvin tells them they need to take down the main threat first and then focus on the demon since it's still sealed. Kelvin opens the door and they all walk in. The room is filled with the skulls of different creatures and Gerard is unsettled by this sight. There's a girl chained at the center of the room. Victor the Archdemon is standing on a mountain of skulls. He welcomes them and Kelvin smiles at the potential strength of the demon. Kelvin asks him who the chained woman is and Victor tells him she's the daughter of the demon lord as he shuts the door and seals it. Delphina tells him she could be the daughter of the last demon lord Gustav, but she says there was no knowledge of him having a daughter. Kelvin tells Victor the demon lord didn't have a daughter and Victor tells him that was what the demon lord wanted everyone to believe. He tells them he hid his daughter to protect her from the many enemies he made. Victor is glad such a powerful human came since he had cleared out the other demons in the dungeon to make it easier for adventurers to reach the room. He's glad he let the adventurers who found the room initially escape with their lives. Kelvin realizes the scenario was a trap by Victor. Victor tells him only humans can break the seal on Gustav's daughter. Kelvin asks Victor if he wants him to break it and he says he would never ask that of a human. He tells Kelvin he just needs him to be his dinner for that day so he can absorb his powers. He lunges at Kelvin but Gerard intercepts him with his shield. He lands close to the sealed demon and explains how his skill lets him absorb the abilities of those he eats. He tells Kelvin the skill is more effective if whoever he eats is in a close relationship with him. Kelvin now understands he wants to eat them, break the seal and let loose a new demon lord. He uses his air pressure skill but it can't immobilize Victor. Victor tells him he's only half right as he looks at Gustav's daughter hungrily. He tells Kelvin he has been looking after her like she was his daughter but he would gain a lot of power and become the new demon lord if he gets to eat her. Kelvin is surprised at the power of an S-rank demon. Victor asks him why he's been smiling all this while and Kelvin tells him he's excited because he has never met such a worthy opponent. Delphina tells his companions that it's just his bad habit. Ethel asks Gerard what Kelvin's bad habit is and he tells her when Kelvin fought him, he smiled throughout as well. He tells her the more powerful the enemy, the more excited Kelvin tends to get. Victor is interested in Kelvin so he decides to show him something interesting. Victor summons a group of soldiers from the pile of skulls. Kelvin is excited to see Victor can use dark magic. Victor orders his soldiers to attack and they lunge towards Kelvin. Kelvin analyzes them and observes that they have the strength of a B-rank monster. Kelvin takes out some of them with his wind strike and Gerard does justice to the others. As they defeat the soldiers, more soldiers arise from the piles of skulls. Gerard rushes off to face the army of the undead, leaving Kelvin to handle Victor. Victor praises their battle prowess despite their young age. Kelvin tells him he sounds condescending and concludes that he's still going easy on them. Victor tells him he must be a battle junkie since he has been wearing a smile on his face since the battle started. Kelvin tells him he always gets excited during battles. It's like a sickness with no treatment. Victor tells him it's high time he wipes that smile off his face. He punches the ground and raises a cloud of dust. Gerard tells Kelvin he's using the dust cloud to hide his presence, but Kelvin tells him he already memorized Victor's presence. Kelvin tells Gerard Victor is using his burrowing skill to attack them from underneath. Victor notices that Kelvin is aware of his presence and tries to run away but Gerard sends a sword strike to his location. Victor tries to catch Kelvin with a surprise attack from underneath but he jumps to safety just in time. Gerard engages Victor in combat but his sword is useless against him. Victor knocks him back with a magic spell. Kelvin analyzes Victor and notices he has armored skin as well as slicing resistance. That's why Gerard's attacks are ineffective against him. Victor extends his hand to the ground and tells Kelvin his attack will be much faster this time. Kelvin looks at the floor around him, trying to predict where Victor will attack from. Victor's hand bursts through the floor and grabs at Kelvin but he blocks it with his staff. The impact knocks him towards Victor who sneers at him and he immediately calls for Clotho like a kid calls for their mother when they are scared. Clotho attaches itself to Victor's right arm and Victor is surprised to see the slime. Kelvin tells Victor since physical attacks don't work on him, maybe a magic skill will. Clotho activates his mana drain skill and Victor tries to blast him off but Kelvin sends magical rings to his left arm to make it useless. Victor tells Kelvin he's stronger than he expected. Gerard commends Kelvin but Kelvin tells him he won't be able to suppress him for too long. Victor begins breaking loose from the ring and Kelvin orders Gerard into action. He uses his magic to strengthen Gerard's sword and Gerard rushes to Victor. Victor tells Kelvin he let his guard down and he prepares to penetrate him from behind. Victor declares that Kelvin has lost but, with a smug smile on his face, Kelvin pulls a Uno reverse and tells Victor he's the one who's lost. He orders Ethel to attack and Ethel releases her camouflage spell. Victor was unable to detect her through the camouflage but it's too late now. Ethel already has a blaze arrow notched on her bow. She fires at Victor and he turns around to block it with his palm. Kelvin is surprised that he was able to block it, but Gerard tells Victor they are not done yet as he brings down his magic-strengthened sword on his shoulder. Victor loses his left arm and becomes eligible for the next Paralympics. Kelvin commends Gerard, but since the rings now lose their effect and Victor is no longer immobilized, he tells them to pull away from him. They all return to Kelvin's side and Victor tells him he's only the second person who has made him lose a limb. He tells Kelvin he must have grown soft because they are living in peaceful times. Kelvin asks him if he's going to surrender and Victor tells him it's too late for him to surrender. He tells him as a battle junkie he should know the real battle is just getting started. Victor transforms into black smoke and Melfina calls his attention. He knows he shouldn't give Victor time to transform fully and they all launch magic attacks towards Victor's form. Before their attacks reach him, Victor fully transforms and their attacks are useless. Victor regrows his lost arm and takes the form of a dragonoid. Gerard is frustrated at the versatility of Victor's skills. Kelvin tells him to activate his loyalty skill at its maximum capacity. Gerard asks him if he's sure he wants him to do so since he can only activate the skill for a short period. Kelvin tells him he has no choice given how strong Victor has become. Victor tells Kelvin it's time to commence the final round of the battle and Kelvin tells him to come at them with all he's got. Victor tells him he sure will as he lunges at him with his newly formed wings. Kelvin orders Gerard to take a defensive stance as he casts a spell to bring up a stone barrier in front of Gerard. Victor bursts through the barrier and hits Gerard, but Gerard blocks his strike with his shield and reduces his momentum with his legs. Ethel tells him he has to hold his ground or that would be the end for all of them. Gerard tells her he can't call himself a knight if he fails at that moment. He summons his inner plot armor strength and knocks Victor back. Victor tells him he'll pay for his impudence as he flies into the air and lands a Superman punch that knocks Gerard to the ground. He's about to finish him off with a double arm pound, but Ethel fires an arrow that takes his attention off Gerard. She encourages Gerard not to give up and tells him they can overcome Victor together. She keeps firing arrows at Victor and Gerard is motivated by her speech. He gets back to his feet and begins swinging his sword without restraint. Victor dodges his attacks, but he's persistent. Victor leaps back to create some space and prepares to land a huge attack. Kelvin tells Gerard to watch out for his attack. Gerard rushes at Victor and Victor tries to punch him down, but he slides to dodge the attack. Ethel launches another blaze arrow, but Victor blocks it with his palm. He tells them they just don't know when to give up. Kelvin tells him they won't give up because they will be the victors. Clotho forms above Victor and shoots out so many cursed weapons, even Victor is surprised by how many cursed weapons he has in store. Kelvin tells him he got all the swords from his failed attempt at smithing. Kelvin tells Victor it's time to put an end to the battle. He prepares a huge attack just as Ethel and Clotho do the same. They launch their attacks simultaneously. Victor takes one last look at Gustav's daughter before the attacks land. He's knocked back into the structure, sealing the Demon Lord's daughter. One of the pillars of the structure fails and it gives way. The huge piece of stone is falling towards Gustav's daughter and Victor uses his last bit of strength to stop the stone from crushing her. He falls back to the ground and concedes defeat. Kelvin tells him he has a question and asks him why he lied about wanting to eat Gustav's daughter. He tells Kelvin they wouldn't have come at him with their full strength if he hadn't. He tells him Gustav entrusted him to look after his daughter Sira many years ago. Victor used to teach Sira when she was younger to turn her into a true cursed fighter. However, he remembers that she was always sad because her father was always away, and she couldn't leave the castle. He tells him everything changed that day because the hero reached Gustav's castle. After the walls were breached, Victor wanted to fight alongside Gustav and get a warrior's death, but Gustav commanded him to keep taking care of Sira. He tells him if Sira is discovered, she will be the target of the hero and other demon factions. Gustav had no choice but to cast a seal on her that could only be broken by humans because humans are generally weaker than demons. He was convinced Sira's chance of survival would be higher as long as the human who found her wasn't a hero. He tells them Gustav did it in such a way that the magic activates as soon as he passes away, and sends Sira to a hidden location so she can leave happily when the war is over. In the past, Victor tells Gustav he should have asked for Sira's opinion before doing such a thing. He asks him if he thinks Sira would be happier than Wei. He tells Kelvin that's why Sira is sealed in that room. He tells him he has been waiting for the hero to pass away, and for the world to become peaceful, and appropriate for Sira's rule as the new Demon Lord. He tells Kelvin that things didn't go as he planned and he asks him for a favor. He asks Kelvin to accept Sira as his companion. Kelvin asks him why he wants that, and he tells Kelvin because he's strong and entrusted by his companions, which includes a monster. He notices that Kelvin is a summoner and tells him he thinks Sira has regained her consciousness. He tells him she should be able to open her eyes once the seal is broken, and she's probably listening to their conversation. Melfina confirms his suspensions. Kelvin asks Victor if he also wants to become his companion and tells him he can heal him if he wants. Victor tells him that though his offer is tempting, he serves no one other than Lord Gustav. He tells Kelvin it's already too late for him, and with his final breath, he begs Kelvin to allow Sira to see the outside world. He becomes motionless and the seal on the door is broken. Kelvin starts walking towards Sira, and Ethel tells him she could one day become a demon lord. Kelvin tells her he's too sentimental to do otherwise. He touches the seal on her chains and they form a metal necklace that settles on Sira's chest. Kelvin calls out to her and asks her if she can beat him. She opens her eyes and begins crying after hearing what Victor said. Kelvin decides to fulfill Victor's request. They walk out of the dungeon to find Old and his men still standing guard over the entrance. They walk through the barrier with Sira on Kelvin's back, and Old rushes over. He asks Kelvin if he's unhurt, and Kelvin tells him they managed to slay the demon, so he's alright. Ethel presents a piece of the demon's armor to Old, and Kelvin tells him the guild should be able to confirm the completion of the quest with it. Old tells him he's glad he came back safely, and he asks him who Sira is. Kelvin tells him the demon was possessing her when it got sealed. He tells him the adventurers who saw her first saw the demon in her form. The metal that formed after Kelvin broke the seal was a clip of camouflage that hides the demon wings and horns of Sira. He tells Old that she's too weak, so he'll carry her back to the town. Old offers to clean up after them as Gerard stretches while grunting. Old tells Kelvin even Gerard seems exhausted. Kelvin, Ethel, and Sira stand on a hill overlooking the city. Gerard appears behind them with shiny new armor. Gerard feels refreshed after evolving and donning new armor and weapons. Kelvin uses his Analyze Eye skill to look at Gerard's stats, and he's impressed by what he sees. Ethel tells Kelvin Gerard's previously broken shield is now as good as new and even stronger than it was previously. Gerard tells her that is because of his dedication to the way of the night. Kelvin tells him he sees nothing but a scared old man behind all the pieces of armor. Gerard asks him what he just said, and they laugh off the tease. Sira sits with her back on a rock and Kelvin walks towards her. He notices she is now calm, and she asks him if he's sure about accepting the daughter of a demon lord as his companion. She tells him she would put him in danger if others find out about her. Kelvin tells her he has an S-rank concealment skill which is enough to protect their stats from Analyze Eye. She tells him she was already surprised he was able to defeat Victor, and now she's even more surprised by his skill set. She asks him if he's a hero, and he tells her heroes are someplace else. He tells her he's nothing but an ordinary adventurer who enjoys combat a bit. Both Gerard and Ethel tell Kelvin he enjoys battle more than just a bit. Sira giggles, and Kelvin tells her they need to get going. She tells him she has never been to a city before since she never stepped foot outside her castle. They quickly show her around the city and head to the guild. Inside, Kelvin is surprised to see everyone throwing a party because he just got promoted to rank A. Turns out Leo planned to use the test as his promotion exam. The next day, Kelvin announces that his smithing skill as well as Ethel's tailoring skill are now S-rank, so it's time they hold a new equipment unveiling contest. He gives Sira a new pair of S-rank gauntlets called Erendite. He tells her to test their potential herself. He gives Gerard an S-rank demonic sword he crafted called Daneslave. He tells him the sword had the same look and balance as the one he was using previously, so he'll get used to it easily. Later, Kelvin takes them to a new house he purchased. They walk in to find two maids waiting in the house. Kelvin tells his companions that they will be working in the house as maids. One of the maids is a woman named Eiley, while the other is her daughter named Ruka. Later in the day, Kelvin takes a hot bath before going to bed. As he lies down, he gets back up because Melfina has returned. He knows that he can now summon her, so he proceeds to do so. She asks him what he thinks of her, and he tells her she's just his type of woman. The next day, Melfina is having some cookies with Kelvin and his companions. She loves the taste of the cookies. Kelvin asks her if it's okay for them to call her by her name since he has a lot of believers in a part of town. Melfina tells him he has a good point and that he can shorten her name to Mel for now. Mel tells Kelvin she has a gift for him for being the first to successfully summon her. She tells him he has done well and draws out a flower pattern in the air. The flower moves to Kelvin's chest, and she tells him to accept the blessing of Melfina. He asks her if her blessing is similar to the one Ethel has, but she tells him her blessing is the blessing of the goddess of reincarnation, which has two effects. The first effect allows him to be immune to lethal damage once per month. Kelvin is excited by this and she tells him the blessing can save him from accidents and surprise attacks. She tells him the second effect is the ability to summon heroes, and Kelvin is dumbfounded. Later, he asks her why she gave him the ability to summon heroes, and she tells him she has to give him a deep explanation about the Demon Lord before she answers. Kelvin asks her if she's talking about Gustav, but she tells him it's not just Gustav. She tells him the cyclical appearance of the Demon Lord is a naturally occurring process, that even she has no idea about how the next one will appear. She tells him that despite that, all Demon Lords throughout history have one special skill called Marapasuna. She tells him this skill has two effects. One of the effects is that it could draw out and amplify the malice of the owner's heart to the point of altering their personality. The second effect is it nullifies all damage done to the owner. Kelvin is shocked to find out about this, and she tells him Demon Lords have 24/7 invincibility. Kelvin asks her how it's possible to defeat someone like that, and she tells him that's what the power of heroes from another world is for. She tells him the power otherworlders possess can nullify the invincibility of the Demon Lord. He tells her if the heroes nullify the invincibility of the Demon Lord, that means his attacks won't be useless anymore. He asks her why there's a need for the hero title, and she tells him it is just for the persona. Kelvin remembers heroes that were summoned like that having a hard time adjusting. So, he asks her if it's okay to summon heroes who would still have memories of their old lives without their permission. She tells him if he's bothered about that, he can use reincarnation summoning. She tells him the two ways to summon heroes are by transmigration and reincarnation. Kelvin asks her for the difference, and she tells him transmigration is summoning a hero as he is with his memories intact, while reincarnation is summoning the soul of a hero who lost their life into a new body specially constructed for it. Kelvin understands the concept, and she tells him reincarnation magic consumes a lot of mana, so it's not suitable for summoning multiple heroes, but it's useful for summoning heroes with high stats. She tells him someone who's summoned through reincarnation gets to pick their skills and bonuses and choose to change their appearance. He asks her if he changed his appearance, and she tells him he didn't because it would cost skill points. Later, Kelvin gathers everyone in a room and tells them he wants to summon a hero. Mel is surprised he made up his mind so fast, and he tells her he consulted with everyone and they helped him reach a decision faster. He tells her they need all the hands they can get so he can fulfill his promises to Gerard. Kelvin tells them to let the summoned hero choose the life they would like to live. Mel tells him to prepare to begin the summoning, and he reabsorbs his summons. Ethel gives him a mana potion and he drinks it to restore his mana fully. He tells Mel to begin, and she starts the reincarnation backed by his blessing. She asks him how much mana he wants to use and the number of individuals he wants to summon. He tells her to leave him with just 1 MP, and use the rest to summon just one hero. He tells her he might as well summon a very strong hero. Mel begins the reincarnation and Kelvin drives his staff into the floor. A magic circle manifests, but no one comes out. Kelvin tells Mel the reincarnation is taking too long, and she tells him the hero is supposedly having a hard time picking skills. He asks her if that wouldn't take too long, and she tells him not to worry because time flows faster during reincarnation. She tells him the individual is done picking skills, and she chose to keep her appearance and age just like Kelvin. The female hero rises from the magic circle. Kelvin is surprised to see the hero is a child. The child stands on the floor and the circle disappears. She doesn't know where she is, so Kelvin introduces himself as an adventurer. The eyes of the child light up when she finds out that Kelvin is an adventurer. She introduces herself as Ryo and tells him all the angel told her is true. She asks him if she's truly reincarnated in a new world. Ryo looks herself over and Kelvin tells her he summoned her into that world. He apologizes for doing so without consent, but she tearfully thanks him for it. He asks her what brought her to tears, but she just hugs him and keeps on crying. Gerard asks him if he possesses a skill that makes girls cry, and he tells him he doesn't know of such a skill. He comforts Ryo and she eventually stops crying, so he decides to call her Rion. He welcomes her to the world of magic and swords and tells her to prepare for the busy days ahead. Kelvin then decides to level up his maids to improve the mansion's defense. He goes to a dungeon and activates his experience sharing skill, allowing him to give experience points to the maids who wait at the entrance. Gerard, Clotho, and Syrah get into a competition to see who can bring down the most monsters. They all agree and Kelvin tells them to try to do it quietly. After a while, a sound goes off in Rion. Eiley and Rika level up. Rika asks what made the sound and Mel tells them they have leveled up. Kelvin tells them they have gained some levels and asks them to check their stats. They all look at their stats and they are amazed by how much they've leveled up. A huge shadow wolf starts making its way to Kelvin and Elfie tells him about it. Suddenly, a shadow wolf appears. Rika is scared and asks for help, but Kelvin tells Mel to protect the others as he walks forward. The wolf dives at Kelvin, but he uses his air pressure skill to immobilize it and form a pact with it. Rion jumps up and down in excitement as Kelvin summons the shadow wolf. Rion and Rika immediately rush to it and bury themselves in its fur. They then get inside the carriage to visit the elves. Ethel tells Kelvin the forest feels nostalgic, and he tells her it's because she's half-elf and her elvish affiliation is having some influence. Sierra tells Kelvin it's strange they are going to the east because the elves live in the western continent according to her studies. Melfina tells them the elves migrated from the west years ago and settled in the forest. She tells them the elves are now under the protection of the town of Gone. They are heading to the town of the elves because the assassins of Trison attacked him. He recalls Leo telling him that assassins of Trison are usually pacifists, so there must be a reason they decided to attack him. Leo also told him there have been minor and major activities around the Trison border. He asked Leo to explain more, and Leo said there were minor scuffles between Gon and Trison, but no one had made any major move. He told Kelvin they are more careful when dealing with towns like Parth or Tiraj, and Kelvin understands that's because of reconnaissance. Leo also told him that Trison could launch an invasion due to some changes in their internal political affairs. Leo tells him though it's just his prediction, she should be very careful because he might be targeted again. He told Kelvin he had a quest he needed him to complete, and Kelvin asked him if it was a special quest from the guild master. He raised a piece of parchment and told him the quest was directly from the beast King Leonhardt Gone. He told him King Leonhardt would be there himself to oversee his S-rank promotion exam. Gerard asks him why a king would personally send a notice to host an S-rank promotion exam. Sierra asks him if he needs the permission of a king to be promoted to S-rank, and he tells her he needs the permission of the ruler of 2 different countries. He tells her that Leo pulled some strings to get him permission from Tsubaki, the ruler of Tiraj. Kelvin tells them Tsubaki probably boasted so much about him that King Leon heard about him. Ethel wonders what kind of a person King Leonhardt is. Melfina tells them he set out on a journey at a young age to gain skills according to their customs and raised his adventurer rank to S. Kelvin thinks he sounds strong, and Gerard asks him not to get any funny ideas about battling the king. Kelvin tells him he had no such idea, but his tone betrays him. Rion tells Kelvin if the king is so strong he should be able to complete his promotion exam by himself. Sierra tells her they are going there to protect the village because an S-rank monster appeared out of the blue. Kelvin tells them Trison is most likely behind the appearance of the monster. He tells them not to hold back once they arrive, and they all agree to give it their all. Ethel tells them they shouldn't be careless, and Sierra agrees with her, telling the rest they could be attacked. Sierra must also be a fortune teller because as soon as she finishes her statement, an arrow comes out of nowhere and lands in front of the carriage, scaring the horses to a halt. Kelvin comes out to see elves perched on surrounding trees. He presents his order by King Leonhardt to them and introduces himself. He tells them to hear what he has to say. They look at the order to confirm its authenticity. The elder of the elven village steps forward with a wooden leg, holding a stick, and he apologizes to Kelvin for their rudeness. He introduces himself as Nellas, and they are surprised an elder looks so young. He tells Kelvin he heard about him from King Leonhardt. He's about to express how tired Kelvin must be from his travels when his eyes fall on Ethel, and he stops in his tracks petrified to the bone. He calls her Rumel and asks her how she's still alive. The elder takes them to his home, and when they are settled and he apologizes for his behavior, Kelvin tells him he needs to ask a question before they get on with the king's quest. Nellas asks him if he wants to know why he referred to Ethel as Rumel, and he says yes. Kelvin tells Nellas that though Ethel is now their companion, she was once afflicted with the curse of the Flame Dragon King and has been a slave for as long as she can remember. Nellas is sad to hear this. Kelvin asks him to tell them more about Ethel so they can uncover her mysterious background. The elder begins telling the story. It happened over 20 years ago in the depths of a forest in the western continent. The elves were living in peace until the Flame Dragon King, one of the great dragon kings, attacked. The Dragon King said they should give him the elf who humiliated him or he'll reduce the forest to a pile of ash. The elves had never interacted with the great Dragon King before, so they wondered why it was so enraged. He tells them they still don't have the answer to that question till today. The dragon was so angry he reduced the population of the village by half with his flames without them knowing what sin they committed. He tells them his leg was taken during that time, but despite the chaos, only one elf stood up to the Flame Dragon King, and that was Rumel. She stood in front of the dragon and told him to take all his anger out on her and let the others go in exchange. The dragon said she's not the elf he's looking for, but if she becomes his bride he'll forget about the insult. He tells them Rumel agreed to the dragon's request and she was taken away by him. Rion tells him the elf was so brave, and he tells her though she was young, she was strong and kind. Gerard tells him since the dragon left, the elves were no longer threatened, but they still migrated, so that must mean something. Nellis tells him he's right. He tells him some years later they found Rumel's body deep in the forest, and they thought the female dragon king might attack them again with Rumel gone. That fear propelled them to abandon the western continent and settle in their present land. Sira says since Ethel looks so similar to Rumel, she could be her daughter. Gerard says they would mean Ethel is the daughter of Rumel and the Flame Dragon King. Melfina tells them it's not possible because half-elves are only born from the interaction of a human and an elf. She tells them if the other is a dragon, the blood concentration would be too high. Kelvin tells her it may not be wrong to assume Ethel is the daughter of Rumel. Nellis apologizes to Ethel and tells her he doesn't know more than what he told them. Ethel thanks him for the information and tells him that she didn't know anything about her parents nor have any memories of them. She tells him no matter what happened in the past, she's fine with the way she turned out. She's happy she's with Kelvin and her other companions, and she proudly calls them her family. They all rally around her to support her emotionally, and Nellis says it must be nice to have caring people around her. Kelvin tells him they can now get down to business. He tells him according to King Leonhard, there's a new kind of monster that leads its underlings to kidnap elves. Nellis tells him there are barriers in the forest that disrupt directional perception, but the monsters always accurately locate the village. Kelvin thinks the barriers can be overcome with skills since they made it through the forest without losing their bearings. Nellis tells him the monsters have attacked the village 3 times and they tend to kidnap elves instead of stealing or destroying the village. Kelvin tells him they are too coordinated to be mere monsters. Nellis tells him the elves put up a fight but they are too powerless against the monsters. He tells him even the soldiers gone sent to fight the monsters were also powerless against them. Gerard assures him that they are there to stop the monsters. The others agree and they promise to protect the village. The elder thanks them and Kelvin tells the elder he needs to consult him. He tells him he needs his permission to make a few changes to the village. The elder is a bit hesitant and Kelvin tells him he can promise the monsters won't lay a hand on any elf again. The elder permits him and Kelvin thanks him. With a wicked smile on his face, Kelvin tells his companions and summons it's time they get busy. Sira says the trap they would be setting won't be a small one and Gerard tells her he almost feels bad for their enemies. Later that night, monsters move through the forest under the command of an army. The colonel leading the army is riding on a horse at the front of the group. His subordinate tells him there are no elves in sight. Another subordinate says maybe the elves ran off after seeing the monsters. The colonel tells them their march is causing a commotion and he's sure the elves already heard them from afar. He tells them lowlifes will use lowly means, so he tells them to keep an eye out for an ambush. He tells them General Tristan's strategy is coming to the climax. One of the subordinates asks how General Tristan got the collars he put on the trolls because they are an item that even works on S-rank monsters. The colonel tells him rumors have it that the general got it from a merchant who frequented the castle. He tells them the battle is going to be a piece of cake even if the Beast King decides to come and fight, but he hardly finishes when a piece catches one of his soldiers riding the troll, knocking him to the ground. He asks one of his men riding another troll what happened, and he tells him his colleague just fell off the troll's back. He hardly finishes before an arrow also takes him down. Other soldiers look at his body and they tell the colonel he was shot by an arrow. He tells them it's impossible because he didn't hear the whistling of an arrow, and they are still miles away from the elven village. His soldiers try to explain but arrows begin taking them out one by one. He tells the rest of his army to hide behind the monsters since they can't see where their enemies are firing from. He wonders what is going on. Ethel and Kelvin are standing on a huge watchtower made of rock and he's giving her orders. He tells her to hit the soldiers hiding behind the troll but not to hit the man who looks like a high-ranking officer. He tells her to capture him and make him spill all the information he has. He tells her she's getting quite adept with the new bow, and she tells him feels she can shoot any target once she infuses it with her magic. Kelvin constructed the watchtower while Mel cast a spell of fog to prevent those outside the walls from seeing it. The walls of the village were strengthened, and the Sira cast black magic in the water surrounding the walls. Kelvin thinks if the army somehow managed to make it to the walls, they wouldn't be able to get inside. Gerard stands guard outside the walls as Rion, Sira and Mel prepare to capture the colonel. Kelvin tells them their main objective is to protect the village and they should desist from any act that will destroy the forest. He tells them it's time to begin. One soldier runs back to their camp and prostrates before the adjutant. He tells him he comes bearing bad news and the adjutant asks him what happened. He tells him a new enemy has appeared before the village of the elves. He tells him the colonel was taken captive and the people who did it were not Gon's soldiers. The adjutant asks him who the soldiers are affiliated with, and he tells him they were just a party of adventurers. He tells him the identity of the adventurers is unknown, but he gives a description of them. He tells him the army can't march forward because they don't stand a chance. He tells him the regiment is currently engaged in a battle with them, but they would soon be defeated. The adjutant brings out a horn and tells the soldier it's time they bring out their trump card. He tells him it's time for their main force to attack. Rion and Mel arrive at the camp and they thank the soldier for leading the way. The soldier takes to his heels, leaving the adjutant standing there alone. The adjutant calls him back, but he doesn't respond. The adjutant screams at the top of his lungs for the giant lord to awaken and get to work. He blows his hand horn and it echoes through the forest. The giant awakens and Rion is intrigued by how huge it is. The adjutant tells the giant not to underestimate its opponents. Mel tells Rion to take Alex, her pet wolf, and defeat the monster. Rion asks her if it would just be her and Alex fighting the monster, and she tells her yes. She tells Rion if she can bring down the giant, she'll be convinced she can fight on her own. She tells her the monster is probably S rank, and she asks Rion if she can do it. Rion looks at the giant and she remembers the training she had undergone thus far. She tells Mel she can do it and that she's not the little girl who needs everyone's protection. She tells her she wants to protect everyone as well. Rion and Alex rush towards the giant. The adjutant sees she's alone and he takes it as an insult to their strength. He gives the giant orders and he attacks Rion. He tries to smash her into the ground, but she dodges and they both climb up his arm. She tries to use her sword on the giant, but it snaps as soon as it hits the giant's skin. The soldiers make fun of her for thinking she can hurt the monster. Before Rion lands, the monster charges up a punch and knocks her back with it. She lands on her feet some distance away and she knows the battle isn't going in her favor. She knows the battle is dangerous, but she is determined to prove to Mel that she's strong enough now. She rushes at the giant and she tells Clotho to give her the good stuff. He shoots out 2 swords at her, which she grabs from the air effortlessly. She tells the giant it's time to get serious. The adjutant sees her wielding 2 swords and asks if that isn't a skill peculiar only to heroes. She tells him if it had been lying in her skill list and she didn't even know about it. She and Alex hop on the giant's arm and run up to his face. With the extra sword wielded by Alex, she enters a 3-sword form that makes quick work of the giant. The giant falls to its knees and Rion thinks she has won. The adjutant screams for the giant to transform and it immediately catches fire. It transforms into a fiery magma golem and it lets out a huge roar. Mel is surprised by its true form and Mira wishes she got to fight it. The adjutant tells the golem to use his flames to burn Rion to ashes. The monster attacks Rion, but she dodges it easily. She jumps on his arm again and is not bothered by the flames on his body, and she launches her 3-sword style attack again. The giant bursts to pieces and Rion meets back with Mel. The soldiers disperse as Mel praises her for her good work. Kelvin and Ethel are on the watchtower talking about how powerful Rion has become when a surprise attack comes out of nowhere. Kelvin blocks it and the attacker is surprised he was able to. A male floats in the air with 4 soldiers standing guard over him. Kelvin is convinced the man is strong. The man has one look at Ethel and decides to make her his slave. He tries to charm her, but Kelvin breaks his concentration with a spell. He asks why Kelvin is interrupting and he tells Kelvin he's the general of Trison's magic knights. Kelvin tells him not to lay a finger on his woman. He throws a huge lance at the man, but he blocks it with a barrier. He tells Kelvin he's the main character and Kelvin is just an NPC in his story. Kelvin asks him how long it took to make his character as he summons more lances to attack him. The general blocks the attack with a barrier. Kelvin tries some magic spells, but they don't pass through the barrier either. The general tells him nothing can penetrate the barrier, be it physical or magical. He repels Kelvin's lances and Kelvin is quite convinced of his strength. A smile crosses his face and the general asks him why he's smiling like a creep. The general asks him if he shouldn't be watching his back. Kelvin turns back in time to block the attacks from the general's guards. He notices they are charmed, but the general tells him they chose to serve him of their own free will. The general tells Kelvin to give up since he's outnumbered, but Kelvin tells him he's not outnumbered. He tells Kelvin he just needs to get through him to get to Ethel, but he hardly finishes before his barrier is broken by a penetration attack. He looks down to see Ethel holding her bow. Kelvin asks him if he thinks he outnumbered him as golems join him in battle. The general asks if they are golems and Kelvin tells the general how he made them. The general orders his female guards to deal with the golem and Kelvin tells the golems not to finish off the guards so he can free them from the charm. Kelvin and the general get into a 1v1. They fly upwards and the general is surprised to see that Kelvin can keep up with him. They throw different spells at each other and the general tells Kelvin he doesn't even need his barrier. He hardly finishes before Kelvin bombards him with so many attacks he has to use his barrier. The general tells Kelvin he could make him his servant as he launches his attack at Kelvin. Kelvin tells him to shut his pompous mouth as he blocks the attack. The general tells him it's time to pass away since he won't be useful to him. He launches another attack and Kelvin flies away to avoid it. The general even attacks his guards and Kelvin points this out to him, but he tells Kelvin he has spares to replace them. Kelvin hovers over a spot and the general asks him if he's done running. He notices Kelvin's expression and asks him why he's bothered about how he treats his guards. He tells him no one cares about the people of that world. He tells Kelvin the world is one of freedom and he can do whatever he wants. Kelvin gets pissed at his little speech. He tells Kelvin he could tell he also enjoys using his abilities because he's a battle junkie. Kelvin tells him strength makes him excited, but if the general only cares about himself and not anyone else, he's just pathetic. They both express their hate for each other. The general summons his barrier and Kelvin summons a vortex on his staff. They both attack each other, leading to a huge explosion. The general gets a cut on his face and he's furious Kelvin scarred him. Kelvin's staff breaks and he's sad about this. He gives the staff to Clotho to make him a better staff. The general tells him he'll pay for what he did and Kelvin tells him he just gave him a little lesson on pain. He tells Kelvin he will destroy him. He raises his staff and tells Kelvin to witness his ultimate S-rank magic. Kelvin tells him to show him what he's got. He tells Kelvin not to underestimate him as he creates a whirlwind around his barrier. He tells Kelvin to witness his Tempest barrier and Kelvin acknowledges that his magic is indeed strong. Kelvin asks for the new staff from Clotho and he produces an S-rank staff. Kelvin wants to see what the staff can do. The general tells Kelvin he won't let him run away. Kelvin didn't want to destroy the forest that meant something to Ethel, but he had no choice. He begins charging a huge magic spell, and though the spell is incomplete and he's not tried it before, he charges at the general with it. The attack slices through the general's barrier, but it misses the general's vital spot. Kelvin decides to work on the spell later. The general lay on the floor missing his 2 legs. He begs Kelvin for mercy, but Kelvin pays him no attention. Kelvin is about to perform the work of a reaper when the general's body suddenly disappears. A man tells Kelvin he's done enough and he introduces himself as Trison's mixed demon beast army general. The man is standing on a huge metal knight who's holding the general in its palms. He tells Kelvin he's the one who came up with the plan to attack the elven village. Kelvin tells him he will pay for that, but he needs to return General Clive's body. The man tells him he can't because General Clive is still valuable to him. Kelvin asks the general if he took the body by summoning, but he says it's not an ordinary summoning, and the metal knight must have a special ability. The general is shocked he found that out and he tells him he must know a lot about summoning. He tells him he just came to tell him he's defeated them and they'll simply retreat until their paths cross again. Rion asks Kelvin if he's alright and he tells her he's fine. He asks about the others and she tells him they're alright. She tells him he finally used an S-rank spell and Mel says the battle ended in a tie. Gerard asks him what happened to the general and he tells him he let him go. He tells them he's heading back to the village and they all head back. They tell the elder they defeated Trison's S-rank monster and took down their general, so the village is now safe. He tells his people to prepare a banquet to celebrate their freedom and to thank their saviors. Gerard reminds Ethel of when Kelvin told the general not to touch his woman. She tells him she was happy when he used that line just as Kelvin joins them. Kelvin asks her what line he used and she's so surprised she collapses from embarrassment. Kelvin asks her what's wrong and Gerard tells him she'll be fine. Sierra, Mel and Rion are racing back to the village to have Kelvin praise whoever arrives first. Rion gets there first with a speed spell she invented mid-race. Sierra is sad she lost to Rion, but Mel tells her to be glad Rion is all grown up now. They congratulate her for winning and she recounts her battle against the giant to Kelvin. Kelvin praises Rion and Gerard praises Alex for his good work. The village throws a huge party and everyone has the time of their lives.